What happens when a nation pushed to the brink by sanctions and isolation finally says enough and aligns itself with a nuclear superpower willing to challenge American naval dominance in the Caribbean? We're witnessing something unprecedented unfolding off the coast of Venezuela. Russian missile systems capable of targeting U.S. warships are now positioned in America's traditional sphere of influence. And this isn't some Cold War relic or distant memory. This is happening right now in 2025, and it represents a fundamental shift in how global power operates. For decades, the United States has maintained unchallenged military supremacy in the Western Hemisphere through the Monroe Doctrine. But that assumption is crumbling before our eyes. Venezuela, economically strangled and diplomatically cornered by Washington's maximum pressure campaign, has found a powerful ally in Moscow. And Russia is more than willing to demonstrate that American aircraft carriers and destroyers are no longer invulnerable in waters we've long considered our own. This development forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Our foreign policy choices have consequences, and sometimes those consequences involve transforming regional conflicts into potential flashpoints between nuclear-armed powers. The question isn't whether Venezuela has the right to defend itself or seek alliances. Every sovereign nation does. The real question is whether we've learned anything from decades of interventionist policies that consistently produce exactly the opposite of their intended results. Let me start by acknowledging something that makes many people uncomfortable in Washington's foreign policy establishment. We are living through the consequences of our own choices, and those consequences are now manifesting in ways that directly threaten American security interests in our own hemisphere. When Russian military advisors began arriving in Venezuela with advanced missile systems capable of tracking and potentially engaging United States naval vessels, the reaction from the Pentagon and State Department was predictable outrage and condemnation. But if we're being honest with ourselves, if we're willing to look at this situation with clear eyes, rather than through the distorted lens of American exceptionalism, we have to ask ourselves how we arrived at this point. We have to trace the line of decisions, the cascade of sanctions, the regime change operations, the diplomatic isolation, and the absolute refusal to engage in meaningful dialogue that brought us to a moment where a country 90 miles from Florida is hosting Russian military infrastructure designed specifically to counter American power projection. I've spent my entire career studying international relations, economic development, and the architecture of global power. And I can tell you with complete certainty that what's happening in Venezuela right now is not an isolated incident or some random provocation by a rogue state. This is the logical, predictable outcome of a foreign policy approach that has dominated American thinking since the end of the Cold War. An approach that assumes the United States has the unilateral right to determine which governments are legitimate, which economic systems are acceptable, and which nations deserve to be integrated into the global economy, versus which ones should be crushed through comprehensive sanctions regimes. Venezuela's turn toward Russia and Russia's willingness to establish a military presence that directly challenges American naval supremacy in the Caribbean is a direct response to more than 2 decades of American policy that has sought not to reform or influence the Venezuelan government, but to overthrow it entirely. Think about what we've done to Venezuela over the past 15 years. We've frozen billions of dollars in Venezuelan assets held in American and European banks. We've blocked Venezuela from accessing international financial systems. We've prevented the country from selling its oil on global markets, even though Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. We've confiscated Venezuelan-owned refining facilities in the United States. We've imposed sanctions on hundreds of individuals and dozens of companies. We've recognized an opposition politician who never won a presidential election as the supposed legitimate president of Venezuela. We've attempted to organize military coups. We've funded opposition groups. We've used every tool of economic warfare short of actual military invasion to try to force the Venezuelan government to collapse. And now we act surprised, genuinely shocked, that Venezuela has sought out the protection and partnership of another major power that's willing to stand up to American pressure. This is where we need to be brutally honest about how power works in the international system. Russia didn't force its way into Venezuela. Venezuela invited Russia in, and it did so because, from Caracas's perspective, the Russian military presence represents an insurance policy against American military intervention. Think about that for a moment. A country in our own hemisphere feels so threatened by the United States that it believes hosting Russian missile systems is necessary for its survival as an independent nation. That should tell us something profound about how our foreign policy is perceived, not just by our adversaries, but by countries that could have been partners if we'd chosen a different path. The missile systems we're talking about aren't defensive systems in the traditional sense. These are advanced anti-ship missiles, likely variants of systems like the P-800 ONX or even the newer hypersonic Zircon missiles that Russia has been deploying in other theaters. These weapons are specifically designed to target large surface combatants, which in plain language means aircraft carriers, guided missile destroyers, cruisers, and amphibious assault ships. The kind of vessels that would be essential for any American military operation in the region. The presence of these systems fundamentally changes the strategic calculus for the United States Navy's Fourth Fleet, which is responsible for operations in the Caribbean and Latin America. Suddenly, waters that American admirals have treated as essentially uncontested territory for the better part of a century are now contested. Every ship that operates within range of these missiles is potentially at risk. And the nature of modern anti-ship missiles, particularly hypersonic variants, is that they're extremely difficult to intercept, even with the most advanced defensive systems. But let's go deeper than just the military hardware, because the missiles themselves are really just symbols of a much larger geopolitical shift. What's happening in Venezuela is part of a broader pattern we're seeing across the globe, where American attempts to maintain unipolar dominance are generating multipolar responses. Russia isn't just in Venezuela. China has dramatically expanded its economic and diplomatic presence throughout Latin America. Iran has strengthened ties with multiple countries in the region. Turkey, India, and other middle powers are increasingly willing to maintain relationships with nations that Washington has designated as pariahs. The entire architecture of American hemispheric dominance that we've taken for granted since the Monroe Doctrine is fragmenting. And it's fragmenting because the rest of the world has figured out that there are alternatives to accepting American dictates about how they should govern themselves and who they're allowed to do business with. I want you to think about this from Venezuela's perspective for a moment, because I think that's essential to understanding why this situation has developed the way it has. Imagine you're the leadership in Caracas. You're sitting on top of the world's largest oil reserves, resources that should theoretically make your country wealthy and prosperous, but instead, you're locked out of the international financial system. You can't sell your oil to most of the world. The assets your country accumulated over decades have been frozen or confiscated. Your people are suffering under the weight of sanctions that prevent the importation of essential medicines, food, and industrial equipment. Meanwhile, the United States is openly funding opposition groups within your country, staging what amount to coup attempts, and the American president goes on television and talks about all options, including military options, being on the table. What do you do in that situation? Do you simply surrender, accept that the American preference for who should govern Venezuela is more important than your own sovereignty, and hope that once you're gone, the sanctions will be lifted? Or do you look for powerful allies who can help you survive? Russia, from its own strategic perspective, has every reason to accept Venezuela's invitation. Moscow has been on the receiving end of American sanctions and diplomatic pressure since the Ukraine crisis began in 2014. Russia has watched as NATO has expanded right up to its borders despite repeated promises that such expansion would never happen. Russia has seen the United States withdraw from arms control agreements, position missile defense systems in Eastern Europe, and maintain a military posture that Moscow views as fundamentally threatening. So when an opportunity arises to establish a military presence in the Western Hemisphere in America's traditional sphere of influence, Russia sees it as both strategic leverage and a form of symmetry. If the United States can have military bases and missile systems right on Russia's borders, why shouldn't Russia be able to establish similar capabilities near American territory? This is the logic of great power competition, and it's a logic that should be deeply familiar to anyone who studies history. We saw this same pattern play out during the original Cold War. The Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba in 1962. Not because Nikita Khrushchev woke up one morning and decided to randomly threaten the United States, but because the United States had already placed nuclear missiles in Turkey aimed at the Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world closer to nuclear war than any event before or since, was fundamentally about symmetry and about the fact that actions have reactions. What we're seeing now in Venezuela isn't identical to the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it rhymes with that history in ways that should concern anyone who cares about peace and stability. The tragedy in all of this is that it was completely avoidable. There was never any necessity for the United States and Venezuela to become adversaries. Venezuela's economic system, whatever you think of its effectiveness or sustainability, does not actually threaten the United States. Venezuela's political system, however much it deviates from American preferences, does not represent an existential challenge to American security. The threat, such as it exists, is entirely the creation of American policy choices. We chose to treat Venezuela as an enemy. We chose to implement crushing sanctions. We chose to pursue regime change. And now we're living with the consequences of those choices, which include a significantly reduced sphere of influence in our own hemisphere and the presence of advanced Russian military systems aimed at American ships. What makes this situation even more concerning is that it's happening in the context of a broader deterioration in American-Russian relations that includes the ongoing war in Ukraine, tensions over European security architecture, disputes over arms control, and fundamental disagreements about the nature of the international order. The risk of escalation, whether intentional or accidental, is higher now than it's been at any point since the end of the original Cold War. When you have Russian missiles aimed at American ships in the Caribbean and American weapons being used to strike deep inside Russian territory in Ukraine and proxy conflicts proliferating across multiple regions, you have a situation where the potential for miscalculation becomes extremely dangerous. All it takes is one incident, one moment where intelligence is misinterpreted or where a local commander makes a decision that spirals beyond anyone's control, and we could find ourselves in a crisis that makes the last several decades of relative great power peace look like a golden age we fail to appreciate. I need to address something that I know comes up whenever someone tries to analyze American foreign policy from a perspective that's critical of Washington's choices. There's this immediate reaction, this reflexive response that says, if you're critical of American policy, then you must be pro-Russia or pro-Venezuela or anti-American. That's not what this is about. I'm an American. I care deeply about American security and American prosperity. But I also believe that genuine patriotism requires being willing to look honestly at our country's policies and acknowledge when those policies are counterproductive, when they're making us less safe rather than more safe, when they're creating enemies where none needed to exist. The question isn't whether Venezuela's government is perfect or whether Russia's intentions are pure. The question is whether American policy is actually advancing American interests. And by any objective measure, the answer is no. Consider what we've actually accomplished with our Venezuela policy. Have we brought about the democratic transition we claim to be seeking? No. Is the Venezuelan government weaker or more isolated than it was before we implemented comprehensive sanctions? No. If anything, it's more entrenched because it can point to external pressure as the source of the country's economic difficulties. Are the Venezuelan people better off? Absolutely not. The sanctions have devastated the Venezuelan economy, but the primary victims of that devastation are ordinary Venezuelans who have seen their living standards collapse while the political leadership remains in place. Have we strengthened American influence in Latin America? No. We've demonstrated to the entire region that the United States is willing to use economic warfare to try to overthrow governments it doesn't like, which has made countries throughout the hemisphere more cautious about aligning too closely with Washington. And now we have the added complication of Russian military infrastructure in Venezuela, which means that if there were ever a serious crisis between the United States and Russia, we have another front, another theater of potential conflict, another place where American and Russian interests are directly opposed in close geographic proximity. This doesn't make America safer. It doesn't advance American interests. It creates additional vulnerabilities and additional risks at a time when we should be trying to reduce tensions, not escalate them. There's a broader lesson here about how empires, and let's be honest about what the United States is, how empires overextend themselves and create the conditions for their own decline. Throughout history, dominant powers have repeatedly made the same mistake of believing that they can maintain control through coercion rather than through partnership, that they can impose their will indefinitely without facing resistance, that they can treat other nations as subordinates rather than as sovereign equals. And throughout history, this approach has always eventually failed. Not immediately, not obviously, but gradually, as the costs of maintaining dominance exceed the benefits, as resistance movements emerge and find powerful sponsors, as alternative power centers develop that offer other nations choices beyond submission to the hegemon's demands. What we're seeing in Venezuela is a microcosm of this larger pattern. The United States decided that it could simply dictate outcomes in Venezuela through sanctions and pressure. We assumed that the Venezuelan government would collapse or capitulate, that there were no alternatives, that we held all the cards. We were wrong. Venezuela found an alternative in Russia. Other countries are finding alternatives in China, in regional partnerships, in new economic arrangements that bypass American-dominated institutions. The unipolar moment, that brief period after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the United States seemed to have unchallenged global dominance, is over. We're transitioning into a multipolar world whether we like it or not. And the question is whether we're going to adapt to that reality intelligently or whether we're going to keep fighting to maintain a form of dominance that's no longer sustainable. If I were advising policymakers in Washington, and I should note that nobody in positions of real power seems particularly interested in the kind of advice I would give, but if I were in a position to influence American policy toward Venezuela, here's what I would say. First, acknowledge that the sanctions have failed to achieve their stated objectives and have instead created a humanitarian crisis and driven Venezuela into the arms of our geopolitical competitors. Second, recognize that Venezuela, like every other country, has the right to govern itself according to its own preferences, and that American approval is not a prerequisite for governmental legitimacy. Third, begin serious diplomatic engagement without preconditions, because the only way to reduce Russian influence in Venezuela is to give Venezuela a reason to distance itself from Russia. And that means offering something other than threats and economic warfare. Fourth, lift the sanctions gradually in exchange for specific commitments on issues that actually matter to American security, such as counter-narcotics cooperation or agreements about the military use of Venezuelan territory. But none of this is going to happen because American foreign policy is trapped in a paradigm that makes it nearly impossible to acknowledge failure or change course. The bipartisan consensus in Washington is that the Venezuela policy has been correct, that any problems are the fault of the Venezuelan government's stubbornness, and that the solution is more pressure, more sanctions, more isolation. This consensus exists despite all the evidence that it's not working. Despite the fact that we're now facing Russian missiles in the Caribbean as a direct result of this policy, despite the fact that ordinary Venezuelans are suffering immensely, the consensus persists because admitting error is seen as weakness. There are political costs to being perceived as soft on dictators or soft on socialism. The foreign policy establishment is deeply invested in a worldview where American power and American preferences should be decisive. This is why I've become increasingly convinced that we need a fundamental rethinking of American foreign policy, not just toward Venezuela, but toward international relations generally. We need to move away from this assumption that the United States should be the world's policeman, the world's judge, the world's arbiter of which governments are acceptable and which ones need to be overthrown. We need to rediscover the value of sovereignty, of non-interference, of diplomacy, based on mutual respect rather than on threats and coercion. We need to understand that in a world with nuclear weapons and multiple great powers, the costs of conflict have become so high that we need to find ways to coexist even with countries whose internal systems we find objectionable. The situation in Venezuela should be a wake-up call, but I'm not optimistic that it will be. More likely, we'll see an escalatory spiral where the presence of Russian missiles leads to increased American military activity in the region, which leads to further Russian deployments, which leads to more sanctions and more threats, and on, until we either stumble into a conflict nobody actually wanted, or until the economic and political costs become so obvious that even the most committed hawks are forced to acknowledge that this approach isn't working. How many more countries need to align with our competitors before we understand that our strategy of coercion and dominance is creating exactly the kind of multipolar opposition bloc that we should be trying to prevent? I think about the opportunities we've lost, the different paths we could have taken. Imagine if, instead of trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government, we had engaged seriously with Venezuela on issues of mutual concern. Imagine if we had used diplomacy and economic incentives rather than sanctions and threats. Imagine if we had respected Venezuela's sovereignty while advocating for reforms through constructive engagement rather than through attempts at regime change. Would Venezuela be a perfect democracy today? Probably not. Would Venezuelan oil be flowing to American refineries? Quite possibly. Would Russian missiles be aimed at American ships? Almost certainly not. We traded the possibility of influence through engagement for the temporary satisfaction of punishing a government we didn't like. And the result is that we have less influence now than we did before we started down this path. This brings me to what might be the most important point, the moral dimension of our foreign policy choices. When we impose comprehensive sanctions on a country, we're not just punishing the government. We're punishing millions of ordinary people who have no say in their government's policies and no ability to change their country's international alignments. The Venezuelan people have suffered enormously under sanctions. Access to food, medicine, and basic necessities has been severely compromised. The economic contraction Venezuela has experienced under sanctions is worse than what the United States experienced during the Great Depression. All of this suffering has been inflicted in the name of promoting democracy and human rights, even though the actual effect has been to make ordinary Venezuelans poorer, sicker, and more desperate. There's something deeply troubling about a foreign policy that claims to care about people's welfare while implementing measures that directly harm those same people. So, where does this leave us? We have Russian missiles in Venezuela aimed at American ships. We have a deteriorating security situation in the Western Hemisphere. We have a Venezuelan government that's more hostile to the United States now than it was before we started trying to overthrow it. We have millions of Venezuelans whose lives have been devastated by sanctions. We have other countries in the region looking at what happened to Venezuela and concluding that they need to diversify their partnerships and reduce their dependence on Washington. By any reasonable measure, American policy toward Venezuela has been a comprehensive failure. And yet, there's no indication that we're going to change course because the political and institutional incentives in Washington all point toward doubling down on failed strategies rather than admitting error and trying something different. The tragedy is that none of this was inevitable. We chose this path. We could have chosen differently. We still could choose differently. But it would require a level of humility and wisdom that seems to be in very short supply in American foreign policy circles. It would require acknowledging that the United States, for all its power and wealth, cannot simply dictate outcomes in other countries. It would require recognizing that sovereignty means something, that nations have the right to make their own choices, even when we disagree with those choices. It would require understanding that in the long run, cooperation and engagement serve our interests better than coercion and isolation. But until that recognition occurs, until we're willing to fundamentally rethink our approach to international relations, we're going to keep creating situations like the one we now face in Venezuela. We're going to keep pushing countries into the arms of our competitors. We're going to keep finding ourselves surprised when our threats and sanctions don't produce the outcomes we wanted. And we're going to keep asking ourselves why American influence is declining, why other countries don't trust us, and why the international order we built is fragmenting, without ever being willing to look honestly at how our own choices have created the very problems we claim to be trying to solve. That's the real lesson of Venezuela and the Russian missiles. Not that our enemies are irrational or that the world is inherently hostile to American interests, but that we've created many of our own problems through policies that prioritize the illusion of dominance over the reality of sustainable partnership.